Good afternoon. I want to call to order the April 19th, 2021 special meeting of the Union County Board of Commissioners. The topics we plan to cover today are the Union County Public Works capital projects, water and sewer rates and fees, customer classes, and revenue project impacts. Given the number of topics we have for this work session, we may need more than the 2 hours between now and the time of our commission meeting. If we're unable to finish prior to our regular board meeting at 3 o'clock, we plan to recess and reconvene after our commission meeting. At this time, I will recognize Public Director Hung Nghi to get us started.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Board of County Commissioners. Good to see you all again. So just a real quick, I think you've pretty much covered why we're here today. So, we're going to do this in two parts, if I can explain it that way. The first is really to go over sort of the last round of information that we can provide you to help you make an informed decision about things related to public works. And so we've brought back Andy Burnham, whom you know very well from Stantec at this point, really to talk to you through some of the, I'll call it follow-up questions from last Monday, related to growth and rates and those kinds of things, as well as some of the work that he's done for public works in terms of the rate classifications and the tiers, and to take you through a lot of that stuff. And then once he's done with all that, if as time permits, we'll go into the second piece where we again have a PowerPoint where we've tried to create some options for you in terms of the decisions that you have to make, and structure it in such a way that hopefully it'll be hopefully easy and quick and fast. And Assistant County Manager Brian Matthews is going to take you through that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy Burnham, and he's got a PowerPoint that he's going to take you through. You do have a copy of his PowerPoint in front of you. You also have a copy of what we, as Public Works, plan to take you through. And the last item is a handout, which we probably will reference when we get to some of the decisions we need to make at the end. So with that, Andy, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to make these boxes.
Before you turn it over, Andy, can I say one thing also?
Yes,
sir. I would
sir.
ask that the board not make any motions or actions until we see your complete presentation.
Okay.
So,
all right. So with that, Andy, I'm turning it over to you.
Very good. Thank you, good afternoon, Commissioners. I kind of have three different topics that I wanted to go through with you this afternoon that were in follow-up to some questions that were raised at the last discussion, as well as that build on some prior conversations that we've had on rates and fees over the last several months. The first item that I wanted to start with is a specific question that came up at the last workshop relative to revenue requirements and what's causing the need for increases in rates, even in the baseline scenario, recognizing that we do have certain growth assumptions in our customer base. And so I thought some fundamental background and baseline information would be helpful. So before we get into all of the capital scenarios that we'll be talking about as part of the workshop today, I wanted to just help you understand in the baseline scenario, consistent with the feasibility report that really didn't address or factor in those wastewater plant expansion options that you have before you today, or capacity options, just what the projection of the expenditure requirements are for public works and for the utilities, kind of in the status quo, if you will. And so we've tried to show with bar charts here what the current costs are in fiscal year 21 for in the purple color. You can see that's cash funded capital. The green bar, the second stack, is annual debt service or principal and interest payments. The blue bar is the annual operating expenses, and the orange are for personnel expenses. And to identify what the total of those are in each year in fiscal year 21 and how they move forward in time to fiscal year 22, 23, 24, and 25. And we've identified the year-over-year change on a percentage basis above each of those fiscal years so that you can see the changes. Important to note is in fiscal year 21, we're actually using a fair amount of our available fund balances for capital improvement funding. But starting in fiscal years 22 and beyond, you'll see this gray component of a reserve contribution that's necessary for us to meet our financial policies, 12-month operating reserve plus 1 year's depreciation. So you'll see reserve contributions are a small part of our requirements starting in fiscal year 22. But the biggest takeaway from looking at this particular slide is really the change in the debt service expenses. You can see initially in fiscal year 21, it's about $10 million per year. But then over time, as the debt service components come online for the Series 21 debt, once we get outside of the capitalized interest period, we have to start paying it. And then in 25, we have additional interest expense associated with an anticipated bond issue in fiscal year 2024 for some of the improvements that are again in our baseline capital plan. So that annual principal and interest expense is going from about $10 million a year to about $30 million a year by the time we get to 2025. So when you kind of look at these things today, the snapshot of where we stand, this kind of donut chart at the top right shows our total in 2021 of 68 million and how that breaks down into those categories of expenses, and then what those numbers are projected to be in fiscal year 2025. And you can see that green piece becomes obviously bigger, the debt component. And then we also do have the reserve contributions that I mentioned coming into play as well. For our operating expenses and personnel, we do have to make assumptions about the rate of future escalation in those expenses when we do our forecasting. And every time we do that, we work with communities to look at historical growth rates, discuss incremental staffing and needs, new programs, discuss merit and pay compensation programs to come up with reasonable assumptions for escalation for both salaries as well as for fringe benefits or health insurance. And similarly, we go through an analysis of the operating expenses to look at purchased water expenses or contracts, chemical and utility prices, sewer treatment expenses. We looked at repair and maintenance, other things to look at the general trends in expenses and make reasonable allowances for inflationary assumptions, just like what we do for certain smaller capital outlays at about 2 to 2.25% per year. But as you can tell from these charts, the bigger change is the debt service component. And then obviously that triggers an additional increase in our reserve target in the future once we've completed some of the Yadkin improvements that are part of the 2021 bond that was issued. Ultimately, that will then fold into a higher depreciation expense, which means we'll have to keep a higher level of reserves on hand given the magnitude of that capital investment. So we did a similar projection of revenues without any rate increases for the system and tried to break it down again by type of revenue. So the blue bar, the one on top, represents system development fee revenues. The orange represents revenue from miscellaneous fees. And the green, which is the largest bar, represents revenue from charges for services. So these would be your monthly charges for base fees, as well as your volumetric rates based on metered water use. You can see that in 21 to 22, the year-over-year change is about 8%. And that's because of the annualized impact of the January 1 rate adjustment that went into effect this fiscal year. We'll have the full benefit of that starting in fiscal year 22. And then in 23, 24, and 25, we do have some modest growth in revenues associated with the assumptions of growth rates in our system, but there are some offsets to that in terms of less interest earnings in the forecast as we use down our fund balances in some cases, and also system development fee revenues leveling off during the forecast period. And so those assumptions in the revenue forecast are included here. We've talked about in past discussions a 2.8% assumption of average annual system growth. So this is growth in equivalent residential units as opposed to the overall growth in population within the county. The system growth drives about 28% of those service charge revenues, but 72% of our service charge revenue is actually driven by sales, the water use, and ultimately the billed sewer volumes that customers have. And over time, we've seen continued declining usage per account because of conservation awareness, more environmentally friendly landscaping, also efficiencies in fixtures that are going in for both indoor as well as outdoor plumbing. And so while we have almost a 3% assumption of our system growth, we have a lower rate of growth in our sales assumptions. And so that's an important thing to note in our forecast as well. Other operating revenues and system development fees, because we have a pretty consistent growth rate, are generally flat over the forecast period. So those really aren't changing in part of our forecast. So what we did was just compared those sources of revenue without rate increases, which are the gray bars, to the blue bars, which represent our expenditure requirements. And so you can see in 21, we're starting from a place where we're basically, in an equilibrium where revenues are matching our expenses. As we play it forward to 22, you can see that the revenue is slightly higher than the expenditure projection. But then in 23, you can see it shifts. The revenue stream starts to drop below the expenditure bar in blue. And then in 24 and 25, it becomes even more pronounced without rate increases, particularly as two things happen. The debt service payments start to come in for our 21 bonds, as well as the anticipated bond issue in the future. And also our reserve requirement, that yellow bar, kicks up in 2025 based upon the assumed completion of the Adkin plant and needing to carry higher reserve levels to account for the depreciation expense for that plant. In the white bar, that shows what our resulting fund balance would actually be based upon these revenues and expenditures. So you can see how we would be doing versus our target, which is the yellow line. With this plan of no increases, we would be falling below our reserve fund target starting in 22. And by the time we got to 2025, we would have a delta of almost $30 million between our projected ending fund balance versus our identified target per our financial policies and the presentations of targets that were made to the rating agencies as part of the 21 bond sale. So maybe this would be an appropriate point to pause and just make sure that I heard the question from the last meeting correctly and that I've given you the proper context and answers around why we're looking at rate increases in the baseline scenario, even with system growth.
I'd like to ask a question for clarification. On your second slide, you show a year-over-year change of 15% on 2022. Is that a proposed rate increase? And is that the second 15% that we just experienced?
So this slide here is showing the change in the expenditure projections, not the revenues.
Okay.
So it's a 15% change in our expenditure requirements. Our reserve target's going up, so we have to make a reserve contribution. We have a modest change in our debt. Our O&M expenses are a little bit higher, as are the personnel.
Okay. Thank you.
So this is on the expense side.
Andrew, could you speak to the assumptions you're using for the additional bond issuance? You said that in fiscal year 2024, debt service increases significantly due to additional issuance. So could you speak to what you assumed in terms of the size of that issuance, the interest rate, and similar elements of that issuance?
Yeah, so the series will be a fiscal year 24 bond issue. And so what we'd assumed working with the county's financial advisor, and similar to past bond issues, there'd be a year and a half of capitalized interest. So really the first interest payment doesn't start on that until fiscal 25. So you can see that green bar from 24 to 25 goes up by a couple $1 million. That's the first interest only payment for fiscal year 25. The bond sizing was about, round numbers, around $100 to $110 million of proceeds. And I'll have to get the interest rate for you on that. I think it was maybe around 3.5%, but I need to check that for you.
Yes, if you could follow up with us, that would be great. Also, would this be another revenue bond?
The assumption was that it would be another revenue bond, yes.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Commissioner Rushing.
What projects does this assume that we're going to be funding?
So for the future bond issue in 24, there would be a variety of projects that would fall in. I think the Yadkin water distribution improvements were one of the larger projects of that, I think representing about 30 million or so. And then there were a few other different interceptor projects, force main projects that were larger in nature, about 10 to $15 million that would likely be the bulk of what that bond issue would be for. Obviously, as we got to that point in the future before the bonds would be issued, the project list would obviously be modified and adjusted. But, we're looking at about $100 million in this baseline scenario of additional debt funding needs for the capital program.
So the proposed Lower Crooked Creek sewer plant is not included in these figures, which would make it even higher?
No, that 100 million was really for the baseline scenario. So it would be some more of just the transmission force main related projects. So Lower Crooked Creek plant was not included. East Monroe was not included. All of the different sewer capacity solutions that we've been talking about and that we'll have some more scenario discussion on today, those improvements for expanding our capacity, those were not included.
Okay, so we've had some discussions recently where we were discussing 5% increases for the next coming years. Would that cover these reserve contributions?
Yeah, so the scenarios for the different capital improvement alternatives that we've looked at would cover not only the cost of those additional improvements, but these baseline projections of operating expenses and existing debt needs and the reserve requirements for the capital plan. So those rate adjustments are all inclusive of the forecasted needs. And the differences in the scenarios are just those projects being listed, what drives that total needed rate increase to support all expenditures.
Okay, because our baseline projection was 2.5% increases. And I'm seeing
Correct.
6 and 5 and 3. I guess maybe I'm confused a little there. So if the decision we make above and beyond that, what kind of effect does that have on us?
So I think the 2.5 is a baseline rate increase. What the percentages you're seeing on this slide are not rate increases. They're the percentage increase year over year in terms of our expenses. So the cost
Right.
of running public works and paying for debt service and all the other things associated with running the enterprise. So this would be factored into the rate increase. So that's my shot at trying to explain the difference between the percentages you're seeing on this slide versus the 2.5% rate increase.
So we would continue to eat into reserves?
Yes, sir. Based on what Andy has shown here, on the slides that come later, our fund balance would go down. We would not meet those requirements. Did I say that right, Andy?
Yeah, so really what we're saying is based on this trajectory of our expenses for the baseline scenario, we need to go to this chart here, and that green bar needs to go up by 2.5% so that our total revenue projections will allow us to achieve that yellow fund balance target on this slide. Because if we don't do those 2.5% rate increases on the service charges, the outcome will be this white line, where our fund balances will just fall below our policy targets. We would have insufficient resources to meet our needs. So by just increasing that service charge revenue 2.5% per year, that will increase these gray bars sufficiently so that our reserves will come out matching this yellow line, which is our fund balance policy.
And understand when he's saying the 2.5% baseline, that is not any of the capacity projects. Remember that.
Correct.
That is only the Yadkin project, the $30 million for the extension from the water plant to the Marshville Wingate area, as well as the other interceptor and force main projects that are already identified in the system improvements. This is not capacity improvements, so keep that in mind.
Grassy Branch.
Oh, and Grassy Branch is also in here, because we're required to do
That's
that.
correct.
Thank you.
Andrew, could you speak some to the increased need for a larger fund balance being the result, not primarily necessarily, but of the depreciation expense? I mean,
Yeah,
is
so-
that, I'm just wondering, because depreciation expense, it doesn't actually have an effect on cash flows. So I'm just wondering, is this a requirement in terms of accounting rules, or is it just, could you help me understand the depreciation expense and how that intersects with fund balance requirement?
Sure. So every community has, generally speaking, different ways that they go about establishing their reserve fund balance targets. In some communities, they're done based on operating expenses and or a fixed dollar amount or considering things like depreciation. And so in your case, the fund balance policy and target is we want to have 365 days of our operating expenses plus 1 year's worth of depreciation as our fund balance. So it's not necessarily an accounting construct per se that says we need to do that. It's really a policy that's trying to say we need to account for in our reserve levels needed funds for operations, but also some allowance for capital contingencies. Some communities might set that as a percentage of revenues. They'll look at catastrophic events. Other times it's more common to look at 1 year's depreciation to account for a capital component of a reserve policy. So really your 365 days of O&M is kind of the operations piece, and then the depreciation is really accounting for a recognition of a reserve component, recognizing risk on your capital assets. So it's just tied to depreciation because a lot of times it's a hard number to come up with from a system to system basis, and it's pretty commonly used to do that.
What's the policy reason for including depreciation expense in setting your fund balance goal? Why would one system choose to do it and another not?
So I think from my perspective, I would say that, I was one of the authors for the Rates and Charges Committee of AWWA on their cash reserves policy report. And to me, it gets about your risk considerations. Some communities will choose to account for every system risk that they have in a single reserve fund. Others may have a variety of different reserves for the different risks that they encounter. So when we tend to look at reserve policies, we have to look at them whether they're disaggregated, separate for specific purposes, or all in one, and recognize that ultimately the rating agencies are also looking at your total levels of liquidity. And so when we look at these types of policies, we look at what is your rate stabilization risk, your revenue volatility, and we'll analyze that. We'll look at your operations policies from an operating perspective. We'll look at your capital needs and discuss the plans with staff and see what you have accounted for, how has inflation been going, what anticipated expenditures have come up, what risks do you feel like you have in between planning studies where maybe you don't have needs fully identified, what are some major catastrophic events that you've prepared for or had to deal with in terms of system failures, so that we can then help make sure that the reserve policies are in line with those risks, but then also we need to make sure they're in line with your credit rating. And the rating agencies publish guidance about total levels of reserves that they look for. And for obviously higher rated utilities such as yourself, they're looking at higher levels of reserves as part of that liquidity equation for establishing your credit. So part of the reason you got as good of interest rates you did on your 2021 debt is in large part because of your reserve policies that make sure you've got adequate funding set aside for a variety of your potential risks that could come up that may otherwise jeopardize your ability to repay bondholders. So, depreciation per se, to me, we could look at a number of different factors. It's, I think, the total levels of reserves that are really the most important salient part of this policy that we need to make sure we keep an eye on and stay consistent with our past projections that we've given to the investment community as part of our official statements so that we can keep that credit rating high and reduce the future cost of borrowings and keep those interest rates as low as we've been able to in the last bond issue.
Okay, so just so I understand, we have, our policy is a 1 year of operating expenses plus our annual depreciation expense. Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
Okay. And last question on this would be, is there any way to kind of, in lieu of saving depreciation expense, putting depreciation expense, adding it to your fund balance target, is there any way to lessen that through use of insurance? Insuring against certain risks?
I think, to me, the use of insurance, we'd need to have a conversation about that and look at what exactly the insurance policy would cover and what it wouldn't cover to make sure that any gaps in coverage would otherwise be addressed by the reserve policy. So that would probably be a little bit more of an in-depth conversation to make sure we don't have any capital coverage gaps if you will, from an insurance perspective. But it's absolutely an appropriate question, and certainly something that goes into periodic policy evaluations that we see a number of communities do is consider changes in their circumstances and their insurance programs. But the other thing I'd like to point out too is this is a projection for 2025. And again, consistent with the utilities practice, this would be something that would be updated going forward. So to take into account the timing and actual changes in depreciation expense based on completion of assets. So this yellow bar may not be as steep of an increase in 2025 as what is currently projected. That's going to depend on the timing and completion of some of these recent projects on the 2021 bond. So just want to let you know this yellow line will be updated routinely as part of the process of updating all the other elements of the utilities performance, revenues, expenses, CIP, customer demands, all of it.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ray?
I have two questions, Andy. One thing, I guess through these discussions, more questions pop in my head. When you say, I believe Commissioner Williams said, some of us do this reserve and some don't. Well, what popped in my head is which municipalities or systems don't do these reserves like you're projecting, because I know prudent management by previous boards and administration has put Union County in a position where we get the best rates. We came through COVID better than a lot of other counties. Which counties don't put this kind of reserve? And then the other question, it is interesting to hear about insurance, but all insurance sellers, bottom line is they've still got to make money. So by putting it in reserves, aren't we basically self-insuring?
So on the two questions, I guess I'll take the last one first on the insurance. The other thing to think about there is, what would be the deductibles for that insurance? And then what would be the expected time period that they would pay on a claim? Because those are two things that you would have to cover from a reserve as part of it too. So I think, your points on the insurance are certainly well noted. The other points on the reserves in terms of what they allow you to do to deal with, impacts to revenues or expenses that may occur from, things happening outside of your control, whether it's the pandemic or inflation, is also a very valid reason why you've been able to weather certain storms, perhaps different than some of your neighboring agencies. As much as I wish I could have a mental Rolodex of every client's reserve policies that I could recall from off the top of my head, unfortunately, we'll have to get back to you on a list of maybe some other county systems. But there are systems that we work with that factor in rolling average capital. This is the Orange Water and Sewer Authority, over by Chapel Hill. OWASA, they factor in, an operating reserve, plus they use a percentage of their 3-year rolling capital expense as part of the basis of their reserve policy. And additionally, they have a rate stabilization reserve as well as a long-term capital improvement reserve to cover things that they don't have in their capital improvement program. And OWASA is a similarly high credit rating, because when you add up those different types of reserves that they have, again, they come out very similar to the levels of liquidity that the rating agencies are looking for of a very strong and financially resilient utility system. So we could do some research on that and get some other maybe more local examples for you of some other agencies' reserve policies. I will say that many times they're more informal policies and they're not published formal policies. OWASA is a published formal policy. So that may be some kind of informal conversations about what those communities use as part of their rate setting process for, their reserve targets.
Well, I wasn't asking for you to get it. I'm saying the practice of keeping these reserves covers us. I know one thing for the benefit of Commissioner Williams, last year when he wasn't on the board, I believe I heard it mentioned that we lost $250,000 a month because the governor said we could not charge late fees. Is that correct, Mr. Manager?
I'm not sure it was $250,000 a month, but it was significant.
So for the total of the period of time that we couldn't charge late fees because of the governor's executive order, we lost about $380,000 in total.
Right. And it could have went longer because we were in a period there at one time when we didn't know what the future held. And these people, they didn't have to pay their water bills or utilities, and they couldn't be cut off.
That is also true. So a lot of the folks, we've contacted them, and they are on payment plans now, so that over time, they will pay us back for the cost of the water. I don't believe we can recover the late fees that weren't charged, but we can go back and charge for the water.
Yes, and it just seems like we've been trained in the last 12 months of what can happen and why you need reserves.
Commissioner Rape, I
think that's
do
very good.
recall during that period of time when we were having the discussions about the customers that were not paying and how much we were holding in late payments. And the discussion around the state, particularly for smaller utilities, municipal utilities, it really having to hold those I'll call it debt for those customers really put a strain on their financial systems because they did not have the reserves to withstand that, and many of them were reaching a point of, I'll call insolvency, until the state had to step in.
And my point is, pre-COVID, we didn't know how important reserves could be. Thank you, Andy.
The other thing,
I think that,
other thing I'd like to point out, and Ms. Lyles, maybe if in spare time in the future, we were able to achieve interest rates that were considered phenomenal. And I have to congratulate our staff for being so prepared and effective that it allowed us to do that. And their plan with the reserves is one of the major things. If what I'm saying on these last bonds, if you take incrementally up to another percent, not, maybe a 1/4% at a time, how much more would that have cost us? You know what I'm saying? In other words, it cost us an extra $100,000 a month, a year, whatever, if the percent went up. So therefore, those reserves are saving us. And if you have to look at what you're saving there too as well, so.
yeah, we've
no hurry.
actually worked with financial advisors in the past to do that type of analysis on different levels of reserve policies. And it's hard to perfectly isolate the reserves as part of the credit rating because of the intricacies of the matrices that the rating agencies use. But we had estimated it was about 1/4 to 1/2% on the interest rate, based upon how those different scorecards could be leveraged by each of the respective rating agencies. And on a $300 million bond issue, that's pretty substantial in terms of annual savings on interest expenses.
Okay, thank you.
So is there anything further on the revenue and expenses, and understanding of the baseline need for increases and what was causing those before I move on to some of the cost of service and customer classification items that I mentioned?
Let's go ahead.
Okay, very good. So we've had conversations in the past about the cost of service analysis that we performed for the county. Ultimately, we really did follow by the book processes from the American Water Works Association and WEF to recognize the different functions of each of your different utility systems that really drive the cost that Public Works has, and to do a deep dive into customer classifications to see how customers use these functions differently based upon their types of demands, the nature of their service characteristics, the types of facilities being used to serve them. One of the key points that we made when we did the analysis was that we're having to make estimates today about some of those customer demand behaviors based on available data. These methods in the manual M1 for AWWA have been around for decades, and there's a process to identify estimates for different customer classes and to test those against overall system data to make sure that they're reasonable. But with the advent of advanced metering infrastructure and technology that is becoming more prevalent, communities are able to now actually collect this information and remove some of those estimating processes. And we don't have that here in Union County today, but at some point in the future, as AMI data becomes available, if it were to be rolled out in the utility, that would greatly enhance the cost of service allocation process and provide even more precision about those customer usage characteristics. The other point about the cost of service study that I would like to remind everyone is that when we did this, it was based on budgeted fiscal year 20 costs and 2019 customer data and information that was available. And I think that'll become relevant here as we get to the end of the conversation on cost of service about what the future holds for costs that could impact what the analysis looks like. So ultimately, the objectives of this cost of service analysis were really to determine the cost to provide service to each customer class and to evaluate how our revenues are collecting or are covering those costs from each respective customer class. Because our long-term objective is to make sure those things are in alignment for all the customers on the system, notwithstanding the fact that things can vary from year to year. We want to make sure that we've got a reasonable correlation between those. So for the water system, you may recall this graphic that I presented previously that just showed how we broke the system cost down between what was associated with supplying the water, treating it, transmitting and distributing it to customers, and then ultimately for metering customer use, billing customers, and managing accounts. And the reason that's important is because the different functions of the system are sized to meet different demand patterns. So our source of supply system has to be large enough to meet our total water supply needs throughout the entire year. And while our treatment plant has to not only meet those total demands, our treatment facilities have to be sized and are permitted to meet the demands on our maximum day. And while our transmission and distribution system has to meet those average or total demands and those demands that occur on that highest day, they also have to be able to meet those highest demands that occur in that peak hour. When we may have everyone using water simultaneously, there could be fires on the system. We have to be able to meet those instantaneous demands of customers in our distribution, pumping, and storage network. And so to understand how customers contribute to each of those different demand profiles, we worked with staff to look at a pretty granular view of the different customers within the county, even beyond what you currently have identified in your rate structure today. So the legend on the right is ordered because I know some of the bars are hard to see, but it does follow the legend in the order on the right that we can. Let's look at the top bar, that represents Pilgrim's Pride. And then if you go down visually, the next is for Monroe, then Wingate. Then we have farms that were identified, nurseries, and these are specifically accounts that have metered service connections. These aren't the ones that are accessing hydrants. These are customers that have metered service connections. Separate irrigation only meters. We looked at industrial customers in purple, institutional accounts, multifamily, businesses, and then single family residential. So that we could see by month in fiscal year 19 from July to June, again, on a fiscal year basis, how the water use was occurring on the system. And you can see that obviously the peaks on the system were in June, July. They're the highest months of water use for the utility, and then how those demands changed throughout the rest of the year. But what's helpful is when you start taking each of these customer groups and looking at them individually, because that's what we need to do to understand how each customer is using water differently throughout the year, to understand what their use of the system is in those maximum months, and then estimate what that is on the maximum day and in the peak hour of that test year. So the first one that I wanted to take a deeper dive into were those properties that we grouped together that were largely nurseries. And so we took and identified just for the nurseries what their distribution of water use is throughout that same fiscal year. And you can see that in the maximum month, as compared to their average, their maximum month was about 1.48 times their average use throughout the year. They've got a pretty high concentration in July and in June, very consistent with the system peaks that we were seeing on the prior chart. And that's important because, as I mentioned, a lot of our infrastructure has to be sized to meet those peak demands. Even if they're not used year round, the system has to have enough capacity to meet those maximum demands when they do occur. When we look at certain other agricultural properties, some specific farms that were identified, again, these are ones with direct service connections. You can again see a very high amount of use in July, August, September. Their ratio of that maximum month usage to the average was about 1.83 times. So a pretty significant delta of using about 4 million gallons as a class versus an average of, around 2 million gallons on a monthly basis. Conversely, if we look at another customer group, say Pilgrim's Pride, they have a much more steady usage profile throughout the year. Their maximum month was actually in October, and that compared to the average was a ratio of about 1.11. You can see June was a pretty similar max, but the actual max for them happened in October. And you can see in July, it's a little bit lower than what we saw on the overall system data point. But here the ratio is, again, very low. The maximum month to the annual average is only about 1.1 times greater. And we saw the same thing for multifamily, where multifamily customers have a very steady usage profile, again, likely because this is for predominantly indoor use, and there's less irrigation with those multifamily accounts. So you can see here, again, a very low ratio of the maximum month to the average. It's only about 1.13 times greater than the annual average. And so these data points and observations for each customer class were used to help establish maximum day and peak hour demands by customer class that we then compared back to the totals on the system to make sure we were within a zone of reasonableness as determined by the American Water Works Association to come up with these peaking factors to allocate costs to each of these different customer classes, consistent with what we were seeing in those data trends. So if you recall the two slides I just showed, multifamily, they have a pretty low maximum day and peak hour assumption that we identified, as does Pilgrim's Pride at 1.57 and 1.71. But a couple of those larger areas, the farms and the nurseries, their max day, 2.79, 2.35, and the peak hour was a bit higher, more similar to separate irrigation meters, to hydrant meters, and then also single family is a bit higher. And so these factors we've compared against other communities that have advanced metering infrastructure to make sure that.
Andy, I think
again,
you have
they
a
were-
question. Andy, I believe you have a question.
Sure.
On your hydrant, is that metered, what has been metered at the hydrant?
Yeah, these are hydrants that actually have metered volumes on them.
We've got evidence of a lot of water coming out of hydrants that aren't being paid for.
That's correct. This is
Yeah.
this is what we know.
So this is what's been metered, that people turned in their meters for what they took from hydrant. That's not what actually goes out the hydrants.
Correct. It's the metered, what's actually recorded on the hydrants that have meters.
Sorry, go ahead.
So again, with these peak hour factors and max day factors, again, based on the data that was available, that we know there are certain limitations, this is how we were able to allocate the cost of each of those different functions of the system to customer classes. And so based on what we were seeing with the peaking factors and the usage characteristics, we took those detailed customer types and grouped some similar ones together. So businesses and institutions, those we've kind of mapped into what would potentially comprise a commercial customer class. The farms and nurseries, they had very similar usage characteristics. So that was a grouping that we thought would make sense as a potential agricultural class. And everything else is kind of standalone in terms of they had their own unique factors. based upon the nature of the business types or customer types, it made sense to potentially have them be a separate standalone customer class. And again, in certain contractual situations or wholesale situations, Wingate and Monroe also need to stand on their own. But we ran those peaking factors and that analysis through to then determine what would be the cost of service allocation to each of these customer classes versus the revenue that we're collecting today. And one of the big things that stood out to us right off the bat is that we had to first allocate the utilities expenses between water and sewer. And so when we look at the fiscal year 20 data, we had test year revenue that was about 31 million for water, but the cost of service was about 35.5 million. So water kind of right off the bat, was not recovering the full cost of service in fiscal year 20. So there was a little bit of a shortfall there. And correspondingly, when we talk about sewer, you'll see that sewer was over by 4.4 million. But we were able to identify the cost of providing service based on those estimated demand factors and actual data observations were appropriate for each customer class. So the orange bar, the bar on the left, represents the revenue collected in FY20, and the right bar represents the cost of service calculation based upon the fiscal year 20 cost requirements and the data that we just went over. And so you can see how each of these different groupings compares to the respective costs. So multifamily, you can see the test year revenue and the cost of service is very close. For single family, however, with those higher peaking factors, you can see that single family would actually need to go up based upon the cost of service analysis. But as I mentioned, we are using estimates for peak hour factors and maximum day factors by customer class here. So we've kind of bracketed this to put a range on this to say, look, we know we're having to make estimates of those. We've tested them against the totals for the system. We've made sure they're comparable with other agencies with AMI data, but nonetheless, they are estimates. And so we should certainly be aware of that as part of evaluating these outcomes prior to making any specific decisions off of those.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
A few years ago, the cost of service, it seems to be, was around the $30 million mark. And now it's looking like it's at the almost $60 million mark. What has changed? The cost of operating the system.
Yeah, I'll have to, what cost of service study are we specifically referring to? The last time an approach like this was done, I think that may have been 2012.
This would have been in the budgets of maybe
Okay.
2017, 2018, 2019 time period. I just remember seeing the figure of cost of operating the system was around the $30 million mark.
So I'm just trying to get some clarification on your question, Commissioner Rushing. So are you talking about sort of the annual growth in the Public Works' budget?
Test year revenue, what was, for example, maybe somebody could, before we leave, give me the same figure for 2018.
In terms of,
What was the operating cost of Public Works in 2018?
sure, I'm sure we can get that before the end of today.
Yeah. And the whole system, sewer and water.
Okay.
Because now it's 60 million, right? That's what this is telling us, cost of service 60 million?
Yeah, if you'll
59.1.
indulge me, I can skip ahead 2 charts and get you to the combined total. It's 59.1 when you add water and sewer together.
Okay.
So 30 million is just water.
Yeah, but years ago, I remember the number being cost of service for Public Works was around $30 million mark. And the revenue was around 55
We'll make sure we
million.
use the correct terminology. This is a cost of service study. What you're asking about is what were actual operating costs. We were happy to get you that information, but that doesn't mean that's a cost of service study. That's operating cost and revenues. So we'll be happy to get you what the revenues were that we generated in 18 and the operating expenses for 18. What Andy's talking about is how you actually classify the cost to provide a service. So that's why he's calling it cost of service. So I want to make sure that we're all using the same terminology. So operating expenses, we'll get you that information so you
And to
have.
help you get to where I'm going and
Yes, sir.
try to understand is that additional, if the cost of our employees, of cleaning the water, of operating the sewer system is around that $30 million mark still, is this additional $30 million, is that paying down capital? Is that buying stuff?
Sure.
Buying
You want
equipment,
a breakdown of what actually costs to run the system, not
Right.
necessarily all the debt and everything else. I
Or
mean,
all
that's
the-
obviously,
yeah, if
we
we're
need to
paying
know
cash-
that.
If we're paying $30 million cash for something now versus back then we were hoarding cash,
Okay.
you know, is that where the difference is?
We'll try to get you that information.
Okay.
Yeah, and Brian, that was a good clarification because you're right, this cost of service is including everything. So if you think back to the stacked bar charts, it's operating expenses, it's personnel, it's cash funded capital, and it's principal and interest on your debt plus any needed contributions to reserve. So it's the full cost of providing service beyond just operations. But so let me back up to this slide here. So on the water side was kind of where we were having the conversation. And initially, I had to show the combined system together, but I didn't want to skip over sewer entirely, nor not have any discussion on some of the water outcomes or questions on the water side of cost of service before I moved on to the sewer side. So is there any more discussion or questions on the water cost of service before I shift over to talk about the sewer system?
Go ahead.
Okay. So with the sewer system, here we just followed a process established by the Water Environment Federation in their manual practice 27, which is the picture up at the top left, to really distribute the cost to the system, to the different functions. Here, there's more functions as part of the treatment process that can be easily segmented, preliminary treatment, bar screens, grit removal versus, primary treatment and secondary, which would include some aeration basins and then disinfection and solids handling. The other interesting element for your system that we needed to consider was the East Regional Sewer System. That really does all those functions for certain customers in the service area. So we needed to compartmentalize those expenses too as part of the cost allocation process to make sure that we, again, have the right costs identified for the right customers. And so in this particular case, we looked at very similar customer groupings to start with when we ultimately came to the part of evaluating customer classes. We grouped industrial businesses and institutions together into a non-residential customer class. But then for, similar to the water side, we would have single family homes, multifamily, and then separated Pilgrim's Pride, but also Wingate and Marshville as part of evaluating the sewer system cost of service. And so when we apply the framework, again, looking at the data observations and the cost allocations that we went through extensively with staff, the sewer side, we again noted that the revenue was 28 million, but the cost of service was 23.6. So the sewer revenues based on fiscal year 20 data were about 4.4 million than the cost of service. And you can see that a lot of that is in the single family residential class. The 22.8 million of test year revenues as compared to the cost of service allocation of about $18.4 million. You can see non-residential is fairly similar, as is multifamily, Marshville, Wingate. The difference here is Pilgrim's Pride is an important one to talk about relative to their test year revenue versus the cost of service. They're currently receiving the same rate as Marshville at the time. However, when we do the full cost of service allocation, really that rate should be about $5.14 per thousand. It's still noticeably less than non-residential or multifamily or single family, but it's just certainly much greater than what that rate is today. And that's something that obviously is going to be a key decision point for the board at some point is to determine, how and what to charge Pilgrim's Pride, again, with all information at hand. So for many customers, they are water and sewer services combined. So we thought it would be helpful to bring both pieces together so that you could see the overall changes, particularly for some of the more traditional customer classes. So single family, even though there was a delta where the cost was higher than the revenue on the water side, correspondingly, the current revenue is higher than the cost on sewer. So the net impact would be about a 3%, difference in terms of your current revenues for water and sewer combined versus the cost to serve single family. So it's generally, when we bring these things together, you can see multifamily is within about 9%, non-residential 3%, irrigation 1%. For these kind of traditional core customers, if you will, you can see that generally, while there may be an imbalance between water and sewer based on fiscal year 20 data, the overall result, I think, is generally within acceptable boundaries for variances of cost of service to revenues that will happen from year to year. For some of the other situations, we know we have items to talk about relative to those hydrant meters in particular, the scenario with Pilgrim's Pride. We do have contract rate limitations to consider in a couple other places. So there are some specific customer issues to be considered here, but I did want to make sure that, you heard from me that, when you bring these things together, you can see that the results for, again, many of your core customers are not something that's, substantially out of whack when you bring together both services, but there are potential things to think about as we move forward from this cost of service analysis that I'd like to put on the table and then open it up for further discussion. The first is that, we do think, and there are potentially some modest adjustments that could be made out of this process to reflect the current cost of service and the usage data that we have. But I think there will be the opportunity to improve that data in the future with AMI, and that could affect these results. Perhaps more importantly, the upcoming discussion about the capacity issues on the wastewater side could really affect the future cost distributions, because this analysis was done based upon fiscal year 20, but depending upon your decisions for future capital improvements, that could materially impact these cost of service distributions. And that may not be the case that there needs to be $4.4 million of revenues generated by water rates versus sewer rates, depending upon what some of those outcomes are. So I think, with the opportunity to improve data in the future and also the pending discussion on the nature of the future capital improvement program, I think our perspective would be, we're happy to help support any potential modifications that the board wants to move forward with at this time. But it seems like to us, there's enough uncertainty out there, at least at this time that I'm having this conversation with you, that it may be better to hold off on any wholesale adjustments, perhaps make some minor modifications now, but really update this in a couple of years, coincident when you next have to update your system development fees in fiscal year 23, consistent with the state statutes. You can obviously get some economies of scale from, evaluating fixed asset and capital cost allocations as part of that process, because it naturally flows right into the cost of service analysis. So our thinking is that it may make sense to hold off on doing some significant changes until that point in time, until some of these other things settle themselves out. So, but that's the last part that I had on cost of service before I shift it over to miscellaneous fees. So maybe this would be a good opportune time to again pause for additional questions and discussion.
No, sir, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. The last part I have is relative to miscellaneous fees. We've also talked about these at one of the prior workshops. When we say miscellaneous fees, these are the fees for services that are provided to specific customers for individual activities, meter installation, disconnect processing, those sorts of activities. Consistent with the prior charts, they're a small part of the overall revenue, is about 4%. Many of the fees have not been updated in several years or decades. So I think from a process standpoint, we would recommend getting these on a more frequent update cycle, and probably coincident with those cost of service studies, maybe every 3 to 5 years, to make sure that, you're tracking your cost for these specific services that are being provided. So what we did as part of the study, we worked with staff to evaluate, for each of those different activities, what type of staff members are involved and how much time are they spending and what's their average pay rate, what types of equipment and vehicles are being used to provide the service, and then what materials, whether it's valves, couplings, meters, et cetera, are necessary for each of these specific components to make sure that we identify the cost of providing and performing each of these various services. And so we looked at several different fee categories, and we kind of tried to group them for ease of conversation. The first one is relative to tap fees. I think these were last updated circa 1996, if memory serves me correctly, so about 25 years ago, I think. So you can see the current fee for each of the different meter sizes for water and for sewer. For sewer, it's based on the line size or connection size. And you can see the current cost of service that has been calculated and the corresponding dollar change for each of those fees. We did do some benchmarking on these tap fees to give you a sense of context of how your current fees as well as the updated cost of service fees fit with some other neighboring agencies. And so we've identified kind of some thematic mapping here, the lowest value in green. If you're in yellow, it's kind of middle, and the highest values turn out to be red in this table. But you can see the current fees. You're green all the way across. You've got the lowest fees in the survey. When we did the updates, we kind of moved towards the middle, maybe the upper middle on the water side. The sewer side, we moved towards the higher end, particularly the 6-inch or greater, because there's just not many agencies that have a specific fee schedule for those. Many just perform it based on the actual cost of installing the tap. So it's a variable for each customer with those 6-inch or greater connection sizes. I personally am kind of a more visual when it comes to these things. So I put it into a bar chart just to show you kind of comparatively this way, from low to high, low being at the top, high being at the bottom, your current fee, and then also with the cost of service calculated out for a water tap fee at 5/8 by 3/4 inch. We also did that for a 1-inch tap fee. And again, you're the lowest today, and the update would put you, the updated cost of service would put you more in the middle. And we did the same for the sewer side. Again, looking at the tap fee for a 4-inch, you're currently the lowest. The cost of service based fee would take us up to, the next highest, just below Charlotte Water. Harrisburg charges based on actual cost for 4-inch. And you'll see this footnote on the 6-inch connection size expand, because as I mentioned, many agencies will just charge actual cost for those larger connection sizes, because they do tend to have some different dynamics in each of those that could influence the cost of installing a specific tap for a property. So these are ones where, again, it's been 25 years, I believe, since they were last updated. So there is a pretty sizable gap between the current fee and the cost of service. And, it's been our experience that when we have situations like this, I think it's a very reasonable conversation to talk about phasing, potentially to break up some of these impacts. But again, from a process standpoint, this is why we, would recommend that you consider updating these more frequently, just checking them against your cost every 3 to 5 years to avoid these types of big corrections in the fee.
What if we just went with actual cost? So cost of service, wouldn't that do that without us having to change rates every couple of years?
Yeah, I think for the 6.
Andy, I don't know what happened. I think he's frozen. He's not moving either. Andy, I don't know if you can hear me, but for whatever reason, you just froze up and we cannot hear you.
Commissioner Simpson.
Young, do we have any idea on, just out of curiosity, based on what we're charging now in terms of a new customer, where that cost recovery would take place? You know what I'm saying? like, it costs us so much, but we're not recovering that when we charge them,
Oh, yes.
based on this here.
Yes,
So
sir.
how many years of service on a new customer does it take to catch up and be at a break even? You understand what I'm saying?
I thought I did until you just said that last statement.
Yeah,
So-
I don't think we've ever run a break
Yeah.
even on how long it would take to recover that.
But you see what I'm saying?
I do.
We're charging less than other municipalities.
Yes, sir, we are.
But those are new customers coming on, so at what point do you try to recover all your money up front versus you understand that new customer's gonna start contributing over a long period of time?
Yeah,
We'll
but-
If we recover it fairly quickly,
It would make,
we don't need to go to skyrocketing cost, if you see what
well,
I'm
it would
saying.
make sense if we did have some sort of, something added into the rates to recover the cost if we're undercharging for the cost of, say, connecting a new tap. But we don't build that into our cost of service.
Yeah, let me make sure I think. So, once a customer pays for, say, a tap fee or whatever that is, the rates that they pay in the future are not recovering that. They're paying for their volumetric use of water. So technically, we're not really generating enough extra money to go back and pay that back. We're really just paying for whatever they use for water and whatever they use for sewer. I think that's what you're asking. We're not really recovering anything to make up for that loss. Now, the system as a whole generates revenue, and so revenues will ultimately cover that, but we're not taking new customers and charging them extra over time to recoup that.
And I didn't mean that.
Okay.
I simply meant that when you gain a new customer, you gain additional revenue to the system.
Yes, sir.
Well, based on what we charge for a tap, if it takes 25 years to recover the difference between what it costs us and what we're charging, we're not doing too well. But if it's just a year or two that we recover that cost, I'd rather have the new customer over a 25 to 30-year time span.
Sure.
As to exponentially raise that rate of putting in a tap and may discourage them from putting in a tap. Does that make sense?
I understand where you're going with
Okay.
that. I don't know the answer to that.
Trivial at this point, but I was just curious.
Yes, sir.
Brian, I think, and another thing that confuses it, I think, now I may be wrong, but my question is, don't we have to divide that into like an existing home tapping on? That's where our cost of service is way below, I mean, higher than the cost. When a subdivision is put in by a developer, that's not where this cost of service is coming from, is it?
Yeah, so they already cover their own tap fees when they're making the
What I'm
tap that
saying,
they're
they're
putting in.
doing everything that we're falling short on.
Yes, sir.
They're doing it in one package.
Yes, sir.
So what we're losing on is only houses that are adding on or tapping on after the fact. Maybe they're tired of messing with their well.
Yes, sir, that would
This
be
is not
accurate.
every new customer.
It is not every new customer, you're correct. It's not the same way you would treat a new subdivision. A new subdivision is a little bit different because the developer's making all those taps for that new
On those new
subdivision.
subdivisions, everything's paid for by the developer when he turns it over to us. Or they're installed, aren't they?
They are
Except-
installed, and that's
except
my
the final
understanding.
meter.
Yes, sir, that's my understanding. Now, we set the meter, we do those things, and so obviously, if we're not charging enough for a meter set, we're not recouping that cost.
Right.
But we
That's
do set the
only
meter,
one
we do
that-
those things.
That's the only one that is constant across both of our two customer bases. Existing houses tapping on and new houses that are starting off on sewer and water.
That's my understanding. They can correct me if I'm wrong. I think I'm correct in saying that, yes, sir.
Well, I concur.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Which is one of the things that's more appealing if we were going to raise the rate, rather than going with a flat rate, going with the actual cost of service. So instead
So-
of going with,
So I think your question was, the problem with, and this is, obviously, the board can set whatever policy you want to set. We like to, as anyone, you like to know what your costs are. And so when you say, a line says, whatever it costs, Most folks don't like that. They want to know, well, it's going to cost me 400, it's going to cost me 1,000, it's going to cost me X.
But let
That
me-
we
let me-
would not
let me
suggest
explain it
you
to you
do
this
that
way.
for everything.
Yeah.
We're saying that, the way I guess the other organizations are using the larger tap, the 6-inch, is because that one varies. There's so many different things that could occur.
Well, what I could see is like an example of a self-help program where we have our staff out there, somebody's out there putting these projects in, and at the time of installation, they put in a meter. And let's say 10 out of the 12 people along that line decide to go ahead and pay at that time, which would be easier, simpler, and cheaper to do versus 2 years from then coming back and having just a guy one at a time, coming out there and putting in the meters and the taps. So I can see that being more labor intensive, more time consuming, and more expense. Just like with the neighborhoods, like if you go into a subdivision where everything's done except the hole's dug, the pipe's exposed, all you're doing is putting in a meter maybe, then it's gonna be a lot simpler, a lot less expensive, so actual time involved. Again, versus, and that I think would encourage people to go ahead and tap on when these projects are being put in versus saying, well, I don't want to spend that money now, I'll wait until later on if I decide to do it. Kind of going back to what Commissioner Rake was saying, you have that one at a time guy that's more expensive versus the, 2 or 3 or 10 at one time that might be less expensive.
So if I understand where you're going is, I would suggest that the board consider that making a policy component of your short line and not just having your fees say whatever the cost is.
Well, no, not just short line, but I mean, there's the cost of putting in a subdivision. We're doing some work there, but we're not doing the same work as we would be on putting in an existing home.
Well, I would say that you're treating some customers differently than you're treating other customers. I mean, that's obviously a board decision, but I would be careful about treating customers differently.
Well, what I would hate to do is go with that high figure and a job that takes us maybe 30 minutes to an hour and costs $500 may be different than a job that takes 2 or 3 hours and costs 3 times that. So again, I don't want to just I can give you a high number for everybody and then you might make a lot of money. Or I can give you the actual cost, and if that's what we're trying to do is recoup the cost of the service, because when we do inspections, we do it based on what, the square footage, dollar amount per square foot?
I'm sorry, with the
For
cost
inspections?
that we pay,
Right.
it's based on the size of the structure.
Right.
So that's the fee that they pay based on the size of the structure. Right now, it's very similar. The fee they paid is based on the size of the tap.
Right.
So the size of tap is X. We believe it takes this much time. Now, obviously, this was done in 1996.
Right.
It's different. It doesn't cost us that anymore. It costs us more. So it's a board decision. Obviously, our philosophy is we're not recouping the cost. Whatever you decide to do as far as those fees, that's fine. But just understand, we're not recouping the cost. At some point in time, we are subsidizing that.
Right, but I just don't want us to recoup the cost on people who, it may not be as hard of a job to do one as the other. And it may be a very difficult job on one, and do we need to recoup the actual cost, or do we, per job? Or do we need to just give you a blanket number that everybody can figure out?
I would see Andy tell me if he knows anything about that kind of scenario, because I'm not familiar with that being an option across the board. So let's see if Andy has some ideas about that.
Brian, one quick question. Isn't the shortfall made up by ratepayers?
The shortfall is made up by the system, which are the ratepayers. Yes, sir.
So therefore, if we're giving a break or trying to give a break to a developer or someone else, everybody else has to absorb that.
Well, certainly, the revenue we generate from our ratepayers can only go so far. So the more money we recoup for our costs, the more we can spend on projects, whatever that is, whatever the board's policy is, that could be spent on projects versus recouping the cost from this. Let's see if Andy maybe can answer your question, Commissioner Rushing.
Yeah, and I'll give it a shot, Brian. I'm not sure if I quite heard all of it, but in terms of application of these fees with an actual cost consideration, we've seen some communities just do it at actual cost for every single connection. We've also seen some communities say, well, we're going to charge this fee, but if actual costs are more, then there would be an adder. I don't know if I've seen, there's probably a few out there, but they just don't come to mind of some that have said, well, we'll charge you this fee, but if it's less, we'll charge you the lower amount. Wouldn't surprise me if those are out there too, because these are really, it's a policy about how you want to structure the program to best reflect your cost estimates and the difference in cost that you can see between connections. But then also on the administrative side, what you have to do to invoice these fees and gather cost information and prepare templates. And, there's some workflow and business processes on the back end too that would have to be done to support the policy. So it's pretty broad. I wouldn't say there's 100%, consistency in terms of the methods on this. There's some pretty good diversity in terms of how communities do it based upon their development patterns and their policy objectives. So I don't think there's a real limiter on this one in terms of, what could or could not be done other than just practical constraints, I would say, just in terms of if you run into issues where your systems can't, administer it, or you run into some challenges like that.
Yeah, so just, and I appreciate that, Andrew, just so the board understands that, we're not set up from a resource standpoint to actually calculate that, run that from a system. Not that you can't, understand, we don't have enough staff to actually do all of this all the time, because we're not set up that way. We're set up so this is your tap fee, you pay it. I don't have to figure out what the billing is for it. I don't have to have someone manage that side of it. And also, if I'm doing it at cost, I'm not going to be able to tell you what that cost is till after I've already done the work. Once I've done the work, then I can bill you for it. What happens when you tell me you don't like the cost? Okay, I told you it was that cost. I didn't tell you it was going to be 400 or 700. I told you it was that cost. So understand there are some challenges we'll have to deal with. Not saying we can't do it, but we're not set up to manage it that way. We'd have to evaluate all our business processes and then explain to you this is the impact it would have on us to manage it on an at-cost basis for all of our fees. That's up to you. But
I could just see this being kind of a legal challenge with a backdoor impact fee. Where do we stop? I mean, we could say 5,000, 10,000, well, there's got to be some kind of number, and there's got to be some kind of justification for the number. So,
well, that's what they're giving you, is how much it costs for us to actually.
Right, but if you're a developer
Right.
who has exposed pipes, it's not going to be the same cost. Or if you have a project going in, and at the time the pipes are exposed and can be put in,
We're not charging the developer those same fees.
You're
Those
not-
developer, they're putting in
We're not
those
charging them
themselves.
any fees then.
They get charged a meter
Capacity
set.
fee.
We don't, they get charged a capacity fee, they get charged meter set. They're
What's
not
that for?
paying all those same other charges.
What's
They're
the
not
meter
paying
set
that.
fee?
I don't know what the meter set. 185 for meter set.
So instead of $400, they're paying $185.
That's a meter set fee, because they have to set the meter, so.
Okay,
So understand, the developers aren't paying all of those same
Right,
costs.
so if we're putting in a water line, on a self-help project, then are those people paying $400 or $185?
$585. Those individuals would pay $585,
$585.
which is the $400 and the $185.
Why are they paying that why are they paying them? Because we're putting the pipe in, right?
That's right, yes, sir.
So why are they paying more than a developer would?
Well, understand, the developer's recouping his costs from his property owners. So keep in mind, yes, sir.
Let me cut to the chase here. First, when the developer puts in a system, Stoney, it's not that he's not paying it. He's paying his subcontractor to do it.
Right.
And all we have to do is go out there when a house is finalized and CO'd and they want their water turned on, you go out there to that meter box, lift the lid up, set the meter, screw it on, open the water, and it's on.
And we test it, yes, sir.
I mean, people do that with a pickup, and
Right.
one person does it.
Certainly.
I was just sitting here realizing on these, the cost of sewer taps and water taps, I don't think there's that many done, because on all of these short line extensions that we did, it was included for the contractor. He rehooked the new water line up to the people. The county never had to touch it.
Right.
Is
So-
that right?
Yeah, so understand that. There's two different systems here. You got a developer, he's working a project.
Right.
He or she. Their job is to put in the water lines, they even make the taps because they know how many lots within their development need all of that.
And
We
Brian,
handle, yes, sir.
They tap onto our line with us standing there watching them.
Well,
I mean, we don't even have to tap on, to the 6-inch going into the subdivision. They pay for all that with us supervising them.
That's correct. So they're not, the property owners within that development are all paying as part of their lot purchase. All of that's built into it. Now, if we put in a line, that means the county runs a line. We run that line into wherever we're going. And if we have customers that we know are going to be part of that, then we make those taps for those customers. And that's all built into that project.
And that's saving money.
It is. Now, what
Okay.
we don't know is there someone else who wants to be part of it? And I get what you're saying. Here's the problem. I can't have you wait 6 months later and say, gosh, I sure do wish I tapped into that. I need to know today that you want to tap.
Right.
And I need to know today you're actually going to flow water. Because the last thing we're going to do is tap it and have it sit there for several years.
Yeah.
It needs to be you're committed to a tap and you're committed to getting water as soon as that meter is set. So I get what you're trying to say is how can we make that more affordable?
What I'm saying is if you're gonna go to 1,700, 1,500, from 400 to 1,500, 1,700, 2,000, whatever the number is that in a situation like a self-help program versus trying to make it more expensive when it's a cheaper prospect, it is a cheaper operation because we're putting it in right then. Now, it will get more expensive if you don't tap on
Right.
at the time it's exposed and put in. So that is a decision that people need to make, is that it might go up $1,000 later on, but if you do it right now, it's less expensive. Just like with the builder, like we were talking about, Dennis, the builder's putting in all that infrastructure and he just has to pay the simple fee of putting the meter on. That, there's different various levels of cost in this.
Right. And
There's
what
the
I'm-
cost of doing it when it's being put in, there's a cost of doing it when somebody else has put it in, and then there's the cost of doing it 10 years down the road. And that's the expensive cost, is putting it in 10 years down the road.
Right, and what I'm suggesting is the board consider as part of your self-help, short line, whatever, that your policy be that you have a charge that you're willing to charge that possible new customer that didn't sign on in the beginning to incentivize them to be part of it. But I wouldn't necessarily roll that into, we're just going to say at cost for everybody. I'm saying you make that a policy decision for that program, because what you're trying to do is incentivize those individuals to come on. In the future, if that line is there and someone comes back 2 years from now, they need to pay whatever that cost is to tap that in. That would be just my suggestion that you consider, whatever you change the fees to. That,
From what I hear, taking what Stoney says and what Brian says, if we run a water line during the short line extension, if they'll hook up while the subcontractor's out there, it's one fee. If they wait 2 years and then decide they want to do it, they should pay more, because at that time, county staff has to go out, right, okay.
Yes, sir. That's what I'm saying.
That's why I was getting at the at cost.
So we need to have a 2 rate. When water goes by their house, it would be the 1 rate. So the sub could put it in, but they would have to come in and sign up, put that little stake out there that shows where they want their meter.
So, again, without setting something, I would say that, number one, let's have the board establish that as a policy. Number two, as part of the bid for the project, we can determine what that cost is at that point in time, and that would be the cost that we would tell that individual that they have to pay to make that tap or make that connection, so that they're realizing the same savings that anyone else that signed up to be part of that can realize it. After that, our fees will then apply. If you wait 6 months, you wait 2 years, whatever our fee is, whatever you set that as in, that applies. That way, I'm not telling you that the tap fee is $400. let's have that known by when we go to bid. We'll know what those costs are. We can use that as the cost that we charge those future customers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and
Okay.
the other thing I was trying to say, I don't think we have that many people, near as many people that
Sure.
come back and hook on later. Because really, they're dealing with a failing well, a well that went dry or bad quality.
Right. I think, if I'm not mistaken, our miscellaneous fees is about $500,000 total. All our miscellaneous fees. How much do we generate? 300 or 3 million? I'm sorry, I was wrong. That's about $3 million total for miscellaneous fees. Now, that's everything. That's all the miscellaneous fees. So it's not a significant number, obviously, but it is a number that we're not collecting enough to maintain our costs.
Go ahead, Andy.
Okay, that was a really good discussion on the tap fees. We do have a few others to talk about in that miscellaneous fee category that Brian mentioned. You know, we've kind of had another grouping around meter fees. We just talked a little bit about as part of the discussion on tap fees in terms of the meter installation fee. Again, we've done a number of updates on these based upon current labor resources, cost of meters, all those elements for each of the specific fees. The one thing that we talked about before, the temporary hydrant meter deposits, that one has been increased, or from a cost of service perspective, to include the cost of the assembly because of some past theft issues within the county. And so if that assembly were to be returned for that temporary hydrant meter, then they would get that back. They'd get that part of their deposit back outside of the base fee. So that's the reason why there's a noticeable jump there on the cost of service, given those issues that staff made us aware of. So we did, again, some benchmarking on these fees, again, trying to do the similar type of kind of color coding, if you will. You know, again, I'll say on the temporary hydrant meter deposit, again, because of the inclusion of the cost of the assembly in that deposit, that's what's obviously unique about what we're talking about here for Union County versus what some of the others have done. But that part of it would be refundable, assuming that assembly was returned. We did also have some administrative fees for account setup, deposits, disconnect processing, those sorts of activities. You know, we did update the cost of those different functions. I think staff has some specific recommendations that will be included as part of the presentation that we'll be getting to in a moment there. But we did do the cost updates for a variety of these activities to make sure that they were being, again, incorporated into the process. And so we did look at the disconnect processing fee, again, doing some benchmarking. You know, I think one thing to note is we just have a disconnect processing fee that covers disconnect and potential reconnect, whereas others oftentimes will have two fees for each activity or a separate fee for activity. They'll charge both for disconnect and for reconnect. So I think that's an important distinction when we look at what others are charging, is that they sometimes will have two fees, whereas we're talking about one for the way that we do the process here in Union County. There were some additional potential new fees that were identified for consideration that would capture some of the costs for services that are being performed today that are not being charged for. After hours, trip fee reconnect, trip charge for excessive requests, some flow testing charges for meter testing that, again, would be ways to capture cost of providing some of those services today that aren't presently being done. So this kind of takes me to the end of the miscellaneous fee discussion. Yeah, obviously we've identified through the cost of service process, a lot of the fees are not recovering the cost of service because it's been several years since they've been looked at. So again, process-wise, we do recommend that these are things that, you know, are regularly incorporated to a cost of service and rate setting approach every few years to keep these things a little bit more in alignment. And I know staff will talk about this too, some recommendations on, you know, how to implement some of these calculated fees because of the passage of time and some of the increases may be large. There may be some phasing that Hung and Public Works would like to talk to you about in that regard. So that's it from my perspective. I know Hung's got quite a few slides that and content he needs to cover as well. I'm happy to answer any other questions or discussion items.
A question I'd like to ask the manager. We've talked numerous times about how we're going to operate our hydrant program, because we've got significant water loss in our hydrant program. Are we going to discuss any of that this afternoon, or is that another day?
The hydrant program specific is for another day.
Okay, all right.
If there are no other questions, I just want to provide an answer to what Commissioner Rushing asked. So water and sewer operating costs, just water and sewer operating costs, which includes depreciation. So I'm going to give you 2018, 2019, and 2020. So the cost in 2018 was $41 million. In 2019, it was $45 million. And in 2020, it's $48 million. This does not include any sort of debt service related expense out of the enterprise fund that is what Public Works. I'm not sure if that answers your question, because
Yeah, and it could have been at that rate of increase, when I remember seeing the $31 million figure, it could have been just a couple years prior.
could have been, yes, sir. Okay, so there are no other questions. So we want to take you through the second PowerPoint, and that is, I'm going to minimize this, sort of what's going on with Union County and sort of build, and this, I would say that this PowerPoint builds on the presentation that Andy Burnham just did, and as soon as Brian gets done with the county manager, he's going to walk you through it.
So let me, yeah, excuse me. So obviously, we've got 30 minutes left before the board meeting start. I don't know that there's enough time to get to the decision points. I can start. You can take a break, whatever you prefer. I'm not sure that you're going to have quite enough time to go through everything and make a decision. I'm happy to start and see if you can get there, but that's really up to you. You tell me how you want to handle this.
Mr. Chairman, can we have at least 15 minutes break between the regular meeting and?
Well, yeah, I agree. Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we go ahead and recess now and get ready for the commission meeting and start fresh and with consistent information.
Great. Thank you, sir.
Brian, if I may, just wanted to confirm that future borrowing assumptions. I have those if that's appropriate. Bring them up real quick.
I think there's probably time to answer that question, Mr. Chairman, if that's all
Okay.
right. Yeah, so go ahead, Andy.
Okay, thank you. The question was asked about the fiscal year 24 bond issuance. That was calculated with a par amount in that baseline scenario of 107 million. And that was at a 3.5% interest rate assumption in a 25-year term. And the first interest payment was 1.9 million for fiscal year 24. And then the first 1.5 payments are capitalized during that bond issuance.
Thank you, Andy.
No problem.
And we'll recess and then reconvene after our commission meeting. All in favor? Aye.